Good evening and welcome. You're watching NDTV. I am Vedant Agarwal. Our non-stop coverage of the Prime Minister's power-packed visit to the US. Well, he's landed in Philadelphia. He was given a rousing welcome by members of the Indian diaspora. In fact, these are live pictures coming in of the Prime Minister meeting members of the Indian diaspora, Indian Americans there in Philadelphia. He's headed straight to Wilmington, where he will be hosted by President Biden for a bilateral meeting at his residence. The first time that President Biden was hosting an Indian Prime Minister at Wilmington. So that's going to be extremely interesting. And there you can see a lot of color, excitement, anticipation among the Indian diaspora. That's certainly become a trademark as far as Prime Minister's visits abroad are concerned, particularly in the US. We all remember Howdy Modi and how it all started. But the Prime Minister has arrived in the US. A lot is on the cards, of course, beginning with that crucial bilateral meeting that I mentioned with President Joe Biden. As far as the agenda is concerned, well, from climate change to artificial intelligence to, of course, larger issues like security, defense, the Indo-Pacific strategy, all of that and more, of course, on the bilateral agenda as well. But let me introduce our newsmaker this evening. Well, Harshvardhan Shringla is now joining us, former Foreign Secretary. Thanks very much, sir, for being with us on NDTV. Well, my first question to you, how crucial do you think this visit is? Because this is not just a bilateral visit, but it's also a multilateral visit, given the fact that you have the Quad Summit as well. The Prime Minister will make that address at the UN. So, you know, a lot to unpack, a lot to decode, a lot to watch out for.
Well, NDTV has called it an action-packed visit, and I agree. It's got all the elements of bilateral, plurilateral, that's the Quad, multilateral, that's the UN, and of course the diaspora, which is very critical in the US. This is Prime Minister Modi's 9th visit to the US in the 10 years that he has held this post. But it is a very significant visit because this is the first that he's undertaking to the US in his 3rd term of office. It's also the last visit that he would make with President Biden at the helm. It is important at this point of time to take stock of where the relationship is and to look at what can come, in the months and years ahead. And that's important because if Vice President Kamala Harris becomes president, there is a general expectation that there would be continuity in the relationship. So I think that's important from that context. It's also important from the point of view of global peace and security, because the Prime Minister is very likely to keep President Biden informed about his recent visits both to Russia and the Ukraine, during which he had a fair amount of one-to-one FaceTime with Presidents Putin and Zelensky. And I think interfacing on this with the US is critical because US is a major factor in the overall situation, and I think it's important to align one's positions as much as possible, especially in our endeavor to promote peace, which is backed up not just by our desire, but by countries across the global south. There's a strong, I think, sense that there should be an end to conflicts which impact so adversely on countries across the world.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, I think that what you spoke about peace and looking for a peace solution, I think that's an extremely important aspect. But, you know, you made an interesting point that there's going to be continuity, no matter who takes over as president. I think we have sort of come to a place where India and the US, I mean, it's being described as a partnership for the future. And there is a lot of business that has been done in the Biden years. I mean, initially there was this sort of skepticism, but I think we've come a long way given the fact that there have been so many pacts that have been inked, so many agreements that have been signed, whether it's the semiconductor push, defense, research, innovation. So I think we're in that position where it's only going to grow from here, even though there's a change of guard in the offing.
Well, we are in a good place, as you said, because, we have the relationship enjoys strong support across the political aisle in Washington, D.C. In other words, we have bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats. Prime Minister Modi had a very good connect with President Trump. He has a very good connect with President Biden. We worked very well under the Republicans and the Democrats in furthering that very important, comprehensive strategic partnership. And clearly, irrespective of who becomes president, whether it is Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, I think that relationship is going to move ahead. We've made enormous progress in the past decade or so. And I think the momentum that is there is going to carry us forward. And Prime Minister Modi's visit in that context is very, very critical in providing an impetus to the relationship that would go beyond the current visit, because India will host the next Quad summit in New Delhi or in India. And we will be welcoming the new US president and a new Japanese prime minister to India. And I think that's where we can continue and keep the ball rolling in terms of both the bilateral relationship and the significant achievements that have been chalked up under the Quad framework.
In fact, looking at the Quad formation, as a diplomat, Mr. Shringra, you've seen it very, very closely. And Quad has emerged as an extremely strong multilateral organization, whether it comes to security, defense, or geopolitics. How do you see Quad now more important than ever before, given the fact that there is the China challenge that needs to be looked at, the larger Indo-Pacific strategy, also India is a voice of the global South. How is the Quad important for India and also in the larger context of regional stability?
The Quad is essentially a partner to ensure that the vision of a free, open, transparent, inclusive, and rules-based international order is maintained in the Indo-Pacific region. In that context, I think India has been very keen to ensure that the focus on the Indo-Pacific is maintained. It is not distracted by conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. President Biden did hold a virtual summit soon after the Ukraine conflict broke out to reassure Quad partners that we would not be distracted and that the focus would continue to be on the Indo-Pacific. So the Quad serves the purpose of bringing these four countries together on our quest for a vision for the Indo-Pacific. And from that point of view, I think a fair amount, as you said, has been done across the board, because the Quad is not a military construct. It is basically, a framework that promotes cooperation within the Indo-Pacific region that enables us to realize the vision, as I said, of a free, open, transparent Indo-Pacific region. So from that, I think a fair amount of work has been done, and this visit, I think, will provide the necessary impetus, whether it is in ensuring that the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness or Maritime Security is expanded to include, say, satellite sharing and other data between us and our Southeast Asian partners, or the involvement of the Coast Guard in the Indo-Pacific domain, sort of jointly working together to involve the Coast Guards of all of our countries. Essentially, there will be some significant, I would say, both the review and progress in the relationship. And then we will have to bring it to India, where I think we will look at the next important steps under the Quad.
That's right, Mr. Shringra, and also looking at a lasting peace solution. I think that's so important, given the fact that there's a war in Gaza, and of course what's happening in Russia and Ukraine as well. Many would describe it as a war that the world seems to have lost interest in, but it's still killing people. It's still causing a lot of damage and devastation. So how do you see India well placed in terms of brokering a lasting peace solution, and how important is the US in that for India and the rest of the partners in the Quad as well?
So Prime Minister Modi's visit both to Russia and to Ukraine have to be seen as a part of our desire to achieve lasting peace, as you say, in Europe and in the Ukraine conflict. He is backed up not only by our, I would say, sensibilities here, but also by what the rest of the global South is telling us. I think there is a widespread view among the developing countries that there has to be an end to conflict. And what Prime Minister Modi is doing is using his goodwill and good offices to work with the protagonists concerned to try and bring them to some form of sitting down together and negotiating an end to the conflict. Of course, this is a very preliminary exercise. It's testing the waters, But the fact of the matter is that this time there are very few statesmen at a global level who have the stature to be able to go to both President Putin and President Zelensky and to be able to talk to them about peace. And of course, speaking to President Biden, President of the United States in this context is very, very important. Because as I said, the United States is a preponderant global power.
Yes.
It's also very involved in this particular conflict, and not having them on board is really half the work done. So I think Prime Minister Modi's interactions with President Biden will focus on this issue. They will spend some quality time in discussing both what transpired in Prime Minister Modi's meetings with the two leaders, but also in how one can proceed further ahead in this endeavor.
I think that's an important point you're making. There is a lot of common ground. There are shared values between India and the US, and we have come a long way. But there are challenges as well, Mr. Shringla. I mean, the Panon issue, which is extremely unfortunate, and in fact, news also came of the White House hosting some pro-Khalistan leaders. So, the Khalistan issue, however, is something that both India and US have vowed to discuss across the table. But do you see this as a major challenge?
I think the India-US relationship today transcends many of the smaller issues that could come up. If you recall that when the Ukraine conflict first broke out, and our positions were not the same as with the United States, President Biden specially convened a meeting of the Quad leaders, a virtual meeting, in which he said, we understand where India is coming from. We understand India's position on this issue. And I want to assure all the Quad leaders that our focus will continue to be on the Indo-Pacific. What he was doing basically is to say that our relationship with India is more important than some of these issues that may come up. Some of these irritants and differences in approaches that may come up. Someone also mentioned that over the last 25 years, the relationship has matured adequately as two democracies, as two countries with shared values and principles, that we can take in stride some of the differences, both in approach, policy, and nuance that come up in our relationship. So I would not give too much credence to the Panon issue. I think it is an irritant, but it will certainly not be a factor in the discussions. It will not be a major factor in the discussions, and it will be something that I think the two leaders will spend very little time on.
Before I let you go, my last question, as a diplomat who has seen Prime Minister Modi's diplomacy so closely, do you think that we have, in a sense, transformed how diplomacy works? I mean, it's not just something that matters to the corridors of Hyderabad House. It's really about people-to-people connect. It's about, it's very much about the people of India. It's about how, the semiconductor plant, for example, is generating jobs for our citizens. So it's really about those people-to-people ties that are a crucial pillar and a cornerstone, perhaps, of the Prime Minister's diplomacy.
No, absolutely. I think Prime Minister's India First policy comes to the fore. Whatever we are looking at in terms of the program and schedule is linked to the ultimate issue of how does it benefit the person on the ground? How does the common man benefit from this? When he's meeting CEOs of cutting-edge technologies, whether it's AI, quantum computing, life sciences, biotechnology, he's looking at many of these companies investing in these areas in India, creating jobs, creating R&D facilities, and accommodating that talent pool that we have in India.
Absolutely.
When he's talking about the community, the Indian diaspora, we are trying to carry them forward in terms of what they can do for their, country of origin in terms of investments, technology, supporting startups, and so on and so forth. So there is everything as a rationale, and everything is linked at the end of the day to the benefit of the people of our country.
Absolutely, which is why there's so much to watch out for. Mr. Harsh Shringla, thanks very much for being with us. Really appreciate your time here on NDTV.
Thank you, Vedant.
And well, before we move on and bring in our guests, take a look at this look ahead to the Prime Minister's crucial state visit. What all is expected? How does it impact India-US relationship? Well, here's a report.
Excited diaspora welcomes Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the United States for his first visit to the U.S. in his third term. Prime Minister Modi is on a 3-day official trip, which will include a bilateral meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden, the Quad Leaders Summit, a mega diaspora event, and an address at the Summit of the Future at the United Nations General Assembly.
There will be interaction with a variety of foreign partners at the level of the Prime Minister. There will be interaction with the large Indian diaspora in the US, and there will be engagement with a host of business and industry leaders.
The 4th annual Quad Summit is being hosted by U.S. President Biden in his hometown of Wilmington. This is also a farewell summit for Biden, his final international engagement as a U.S. president. The White House has said that calling the Quad leaders to Wilmington shows how the president shares a very close relation with the 4 world leaders. Quad, which consists of the top leadership from Japan, US, Australia, and India, is a group which has been set up to counter China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. India will take over the Quad chair from the United States and will host the Quad summit in 2025.
Your Excellency.
Prime Minister Modi is also slated to attend a mega diaspora event in Long Island, and the excitement is already building up.
I live in Newark, Delaware.
And what are your expectations of this visit?
Just a very high-profile visit. We're just looking forward and welcome PM Modi to our town.
This is very, very cool. It's a great opportunity. Very excited.
I mean, I think, it's something that, we would have never had a chance to get this encounter. And so we're super excited to have.
Samia Afsar for NDTV.
All right, so the Prime Minister has landed in Philadelphia. In fact, he's put out this post on social media platform X as well. He says, I've landed in Philadelphia. Today's program will be focused on the Quad Summit and the bilateral meeting with President Joe Biden. I'm sure the discussions throughout the day will contribute to making our planet better and addressing key global challenges. So, of course, the Prime Minister very much in the US. He's headed straight to Wilmington for that crucial bilateral with President Joe Biden at his residence. Let me introduce my guests now. Well, Meera Shankar, former ambassador to the US, is with us on the show this evening. Also, Amy Tarkanian, former Nevada Republican state chairwoman and a Republican strategist. Nish Acharya, former advisor to the Biden administration and former director of innovation and entrepreneurship for President Obama, is also with us. And Raymond Vickery, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Senior Associate, Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Vadvani Chair in Washington, D.C. Thanks all very much for being with us on the panel. But before I, start this conversation, we'll have to slip into a short break, but this remains our top focus on NDTV.
Hello and welcome. I'm Vishnu Shom in Wilmington in Delaware in the United States, where Prime Minister Modi gets set for a one-on-one meeting with the US President Joe Biden. Also a very important meeting of the Quad grouping. He has a huge presence over here. He's very popular among non-resident Indians. There'll be a massive community event in a few days.
We would have never had a chance to get this encounter. And so we're super excited.
There's a lot more opportunities in India, and it's a growing economy.
It's a great opportunity. Very excited. And he'll also be speaking to CEOs and at an important international conference. I'll bring you all the details on the ground right here on NDTV 24/7.
Welcome back. Our big focus on NDTV at this hour, the Prime Minister's crucial visit to the US, a power-packed one. It's a 3-day visit. A lot is on agenda. The focus right now on the Prime Minister's bilateral with President Joe Biden. I'm being joined by a distinguished panel. Meera Shankar is with us, also Amy Tarkanian, and Raymond Vickery, also Nish Acharya is with us. Thanks all very much for being with us. Nish Acharya, going to you first. Well, as I've said earlier as well on the show, that a lot has been done vis-a-vis India and the US in the Biden years, whether it's a semiconductor push or the work that has been done in terms of innovation, defense research, security, maritime security, and larger issues of regional stability. Initially, of course, there was some cynicism perhaps as to what really will happen, but it has really been very constructive and fruitful when it comes to the India-US relationship in the Biden years.
Yes, in fact, it has been a very successful 4 years. I think what we're starting to see is the U.S.-India relationship take on an all-government sort of approach, if you will. So it's not simply about the State Department and relations. It's not simply about the civilian nuclear deal, although that was really the watershed. Each department now, agriculture, state, defense, energy, commerce, everybody has a bilateral relationship and everybody has an issue they're working together with on their Indian counterparts. And that's not something we've seen in history before, where those relationships exist at a deep level, bureaucratic level, political level. And so that's going to continue moving forward. I think, however, the priorities of the next president will affect how much time and energy is spent on these important issues. For example, ISET and some of these other things, they're just getting started. We really will need a lot more intense engagement and not to take our eye off the ball over the next 4 years if those things are going to go from high-level dialogue to real substantive programming. And so with Vice President Harris, I think certainly that will be the case, and we can see that become real programmatic partnerships.
Okay, that's an interesting point. And Amy, come in on this, because what Nish Acharya is in a sense pointing out to is that while of course it's going to be continuity as far as the India-US relationship is concerned, do you see the priorities changing? If perhaps it's ex-President Donald Trump who takes over, what do you see as the priority areas if there is a change of guard as far as the administration is concerned? Of course, there was a lot of buzz around Donald Trump meeting Prime Minister Modi, though of course that has not been confirmed from the India side, but Donald Trump called Prime Minister Modi a fantastic man, and in fact they also share a very interesting camaraderie.
Sure, and it's all very promising, and I hope that he's being honest with those words, because I think that the relationship has been strengthening between the U.S. and India in recent times, and it's very promising. And I would love to see it continue to grow and flourish. So I hope he's being honest. We do know, as your other guest just mentioned, that without the shadow of a doubt, if we were to have a President Harris, she actually does have Indian, she comes from Indian heritage. She is somebody who is hyper-focused on making sure that we're looking at how to assist with climate change. This is not an area where Donald Trump is actually very strong on. In fact, he's very conflicting in that particular area, where sometimes he'll say that there's climate change and sometimes he'll say it's a hoax. Yes. And a number of his followers believe it's a hoax. So there are some concerns with a possible President Trump.
Okay, that's interesting. But Ambassador Shankar, come in on this. I mean, the Prime Minister's diplomacy has changed a great deal. I mean, whether it was vis-a-vis Donald Trump, then of course President Biden, there has been this great emphasis on US being a trusted partner of India's. In fact, last time around when the Prime Minister was in the US for the state visit, we saw how President Biden described it as a partnership for the future. Break it down for us. How do you see this diplomacy, in a sense, benefiting India? Of course, economically and otherwise. We have seen that great semiconductor push that has been of huge significance, given the fact that you now have semiconductor plants being set up in India, and those are subsequently and consequently creating jobs. But this emphasis on the India-US relationship as a partnership for the future, exploring new avenues, through this diplomatic path. How important and significant do you see that as?
Well, I would say that the strategic partnership between India and the US has become more substantial and more institutionalized under President Biden. There has been a bipartisan consensus in the US to build the relationship with India, and administrations across different parties, whether they were Republican or Democrats, have tried to build the relationship with India. And I expect that broadly to continue, whether it is a Harris presidency or a Trump presidency. Having said that, there are aspects of their overall approach to the world and their domestic policies which could impinge on, how the relationship evolves in future. With Vice President Harris, we would broadly expect continuity with the policies of President Joe Biden. But there is a little doubt whether, being of part Indian heritage, that might inhibit her from taking initiatives vis-a-vis India. And we hope certainly that that won't be the case. But of course, since the establishments in both sides are heavily invested in the relationship, I think, it should continue with its current momentum. With President Trump, you could expect a more isolationist US policy overall in the world and a more protectionist policy as part of his approach to making America great again. And what he says is ensuring that global, partners, allies, and other countries don't free ride on the United States. So he proposes to impose 10 to 20% tariff across the board on all imports into the United States, heavier tariffs on Chinese imports. And of course, then this is likely to trigger, counter protectionism from other countries.
I think that's a very important point you're making, Ambassador Shankar. And I think Raymond Vickery, would you like to weigh in on this? Because this protectionist strategy that Ambassador Shankar is talking about, this is something that has been talked about. And how do you see this impacting the India-US relationship? Because we also have seen many Indian Americans and members of the Indian diaspora talking about what's now being called reverse migration, given the fact that you see a lot of IT professionals returning to India and looking at job opportunities and avenues back home. And given the fact that those IT professionals are extremely important for the US as well, and India is among the largest supplier of human resources, particularly when it comes to the IT sector, to the US and indeed rest of the world as well.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I think it's always a great day when the leaders of the two largest and greatest democracies in the world get together. I do think that it is important to look at what's going to happen going forward. Indeed, I think that from President Biden's point of view, the point of having this Quad meeting, particularly in his hometown, is to institutionalize the arrangement between these great democracies that are aligned for an open and independent Indo-Pacific that operates under the rule of law. There is a concern as to what might happen with a Trump presidency. Not that there isn't bipartisan support, not that he won't support a U.S.-India relationship, but his proposals in terms, as Ambassador Shankar says, for an across-the-board raise in tariffs to isolate the United States economy is bound to have an impact on the U.S.-India relationship. And we don't need that. We don't want to have that happen. We want to be able to have friend sourcing to get supply chains moved from China to India so that we don't have the kinds of disruptions from an authoritarian power. Indeed, the whole purpose of this Quad and the Quad meeting is to involve India into the strategic architecture for the free and open Indo-Pacific. Without India, there's no Indo in Indo-Pacific. And so it is necessary that we be able to do that and not be subject to the whims of who's going to benefit in the short run, the kind of transactional approach that the former president showed in the past.
Okay, that's an interesting point you're making, that of course it's also an issue of larger regional stability as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. India, of course, has always pitched itself as the voice of the global south. And Amy, is that the sentiment in the US as well, given the fact that both India and the US have to address what is the China challenge as well, given the fact that we have seen the rising footprint of China in the Indo-Pacific, and that is something that both India and US are watching with a certain degree of caution?
Yes, and I would agree with everything that the gentleman just said and shared with the concerns dealing with tariffs. However, once again, no matter who is going to be in the White House in the next 4 years, the good thing is both of them are hyper-focused on making sure that we are keeping tabs on China, but that we were still able to do business. And so I think that that's a promising message. Now, it's the way that they are going to go about doing this business is going to be most important to pay attention when people here in the United States go to vote. You know, once again, you've got Donald Trump, who is going to be more of an isolationist. He's somebody who's been very vocal on putting a heavy tariff on, you know, other countries and doing business with them. But I know that Kamala Harris is still somebody who doesn't want to be bullied by, say, China in particular, and wants to make sure that the United States is still taken care of. But once again, that we can still peacefully do business as much as possible. And I think it's actually pretty wonderful that we didn't just have the Quad summit being held here over the weekend, that the president isn't just meeting with them in the People's House at the White House, but that he is actually personally inviting them into his own home.
And that shows, in a sense, a great deal of closeness
volumes.
between the world leaders. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, yes. I think it speaks volumes.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Shankar, come in on this, because Amy also briefly talked about the Quad. We know that the Quad was largely dormant for a long time, for at least 8 to 9 years after its formation. But there was a sense of urgency within the Quad to, in a sense, counter the rising Chinese threat. And, you know, also tying into the larger ambition of India to, in a sense, carve out a new world order and perhaps move away from the more traditional international organizations like, say, the UN or the SARC for that matter. But how do you see Quad as being significant in the current geopolitical context?
Look, I think it brings together four key democracies, 3 of whom are actually Indo-Pacific countries, and one, of course, the United States, which is a Pacific country. And they really are looking at creating an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific rooted in the rule of law. They all have shared concerns about how to deal with an increasingly assertive and sometimes even aggressive China, which is seeking to apply unilateral solutions to territorial or maritime disputes that it may have with other countries.
Particularly what's happening in Taiwan, for example.
Yes, or the South China Sea with Philippines. So, and more recently, even with Japan, where a Chinese naval ship intruded into Japanese waters. So I think there is growing concern about this. And while this is not a security grouping, largely because India has not been comfortable with it, this Quad summit is expected to enhance the initiative on maritime domain awareness beyond the Pacific into the Indian Ocean, with India participating along with the coast guards of these countries to, shore up security in the Indian Ocean and share information with other Indian Ocean partners. So this is a step up. And I think the Quad summit really today is an opportunity for President Joe Biden to reinforce his legacy, because he upped the Quad to the summit level and has invested a great deal of his own personal capital in building this association.
Yes, I think that's a very important point you're making. And
of
you know
course,
what? Yes,
I
go
think
ahead.
one more thing, that it would also lay out the path for the future. I think it will try to look at certain future directions which Quad could take. And as I said, the initiative on maritime domain awareness is one, how to carry forward the initiative on critical and emerging technologies and creating, reliable and alternative supply chains.
Absolutely.
How to build better infrastructure, climate change, cybersecurity.
Yes.
These are all the areas where the Quad countries have been working together. And perhaps they will try to look at an overall direction for the future. So assess what has been achieved, take stock of the legacy that President Biden leaves behind, and perhaps chart out new directions for the future.
I think that's a very important point that you are making, especially looking at critical infrastructure, supply chains. I think that's really important. But before I sort of wrap this discussion up, let's also take a look at all the reactions that came in when the Prime Minister arrived in Philadelphia. Of course, this diaspora diplomacy is really such a key part of the Prime Minister's visit abroad. Take a look.
और पूरे कमरे में जो एनर्जी थी बहुत जबरदस्त थी। आपको देखना चाहिए था किस तरह सब लोग उत्साहित हुए और किस तरह इतने गर्वित थे, इतने प्राउड फील कर रहे थे कि हमारे प्राइम मिनिस्टर यहाँ आए।
Modi ji is great. He has brought golden age of India back in front of us, and this is a historical moment for us to cherish.
It's magical, and I just can't believe. I met him last year at state dinner. We were invited, so I met him personally.
Well, the Indian diaspora in America is very, very excited about Modi ji's visit to America. There is a lot of people that love Modi ji. They appreciate what he has done for the country, increasing the economic power of India. India has become a super economic power because of the vision of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the Indian Americans who are all over United States are very excited to welcome him as he lands tomorrow.
Mr. Raymond Vickery, that's extremely interesting. You know, of course, the Indian diaspora, the Indian Americans are such an important part of this entire relationship between India and the US. What is the sentiment that you see in the US when it comes to Prime Minister Narendra Modi? Do you see a kind of a shift in the way the US and, Americans, in a sense, perceive India and India's diplomacy?
Well, I think that this is a relationship which has been growing over the past quarter century. And what is happening is with a dynamic leader such as Prime Minister Modi in India, and with the all-in leadership of President Biden, and even the bipartisan support of the former President Trump,
yes,
it's going to go to greater and greater heights. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to attend to the discontinuities between these two great democracies. And that's the reason these kinds of meetings are so important, because whether it be Ukraine, Russia, whether it be China, whether it be what happens in the Middle East, there are differences in approach, and those have to be worked out. We have to keep our eye on the ball, particularly in regard to China, and not be distracted by other things, because that is a great threat to India. China wants all of an Indian state, Arunachal Pradesh, they say it's part of China. So these things are very, very important to do, and it's not just a matter of the atmospherics, if you will, of being able to greet and meet.
I think that's so important. And Amy, would you like to weigh in on this? Because, looking at a lasting peace solution is extremely important given the current geopolitical context. You have two wars raging whether it's what's happening in Gaza or, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war. And the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in fact, has reiterated that this is not an era of war and there are no solutions in the battlefield. And perhaps this is what largely the sense is when it comes to President Biden as well, though, of course, former President Trump may differ slightly on that. How do you see the two countries and the two world leaders, in a sense, collaborating on really chalking out a lasting peace solution?
Sure. Well, I know part of their discussion is going to be about the Prime Minister's recent visit, dealing with Ukraine and Poland, and wanting to hear what message was shared, what message of peace was shared. And so I think that's vital that we continue to have that discussion. I think it's wonderful, that collage that you just showed of the diaspora attendees, expressing their excitement about having the Prime Minister here in the United States of America, showing that these two powerhouses are, working on a continued effort in a number of areas that are of great concern, not just to India and America, but to the world. And so when you have a combination of events like the meeting of the Diaspora, like the Quad Summit that's being held at President Biden's residency, also adding in the UN Summit of the Future, which highlighted younger people, so that way they could carry the torch of what's going on right now between these world leaders, I think is a great message to show the world that
those
we mean
optics
business.
are extremely important, as you're mentioning, Amy. I think that's an important point. But the last word to you, Ambassador Meera Shankar, circling back to the whole discussion around peace. India, do you see India, in a sense, in pole position to broker peace with partners like the US and others in the Quad?
Look, I think Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri has said it's early days.
Yes.
Because this was just an exploratory visit to both countries. And it would require, willingness on the part of both, combatants and also their supporters to look at a negotiated arrangement, a ceasefire and a negotiated arrangement. I don't see that as yet. After the US presidential election, we'll have to see. But here you see both candidates have a very different point of view. I think Kamala Harris has said she will continue to support Ukraine to win the war. And President Trump has said he would like to end the war.
Yes.
On Gaza, I think Kamala has a more nuanced approach. Like President Biden, support Israel to defend itself, but, push for a ceasefire, a deal on hostages, withdrawal of Israeli troops, and eventual negotiations for a two-state solution, whereas Trump really hasn't said anything on Gaza and perhaps might be more inclined to give Israel a completely free hand.
Yeah, that's what the suggestion seems to be. But I think, Ambassador Shankar, you made a very important point that ultimately, it's early days when it comes to, a lasting peace solution, and the two combatants, as it were, really have to sort of come, find some common ground. But I think it's an extremely crucial visit, and these things will be brought up in that crucial bilateral that we're counting down to. But thanks all very much for being with us on the show this evening. As I've been saying, there's a lot to decode, a lot to unpack. It's a power-packed 3-day visit. This remains our top focus on NDTV, but for now, a short break.